Should we rank all the studio albums by Siouxsie and the Banshees? It's probably best. Welcome to By Candlelight, beaming goth, darkwave and post-punk straight into your brain via the marriage of audio and visual elements coming together to make a cohesive, streamable experience. I wish. Today's episode is a big one. All 11 Siouxsie and the Banshees studio albums ranked. Well, someone's got to do it, haven't they? Yeah, that's right. So no live or compilation albums will enter this ranking room. As with any ranking, these are my personal choices. So this is definitely not one ranking to rule them all. Also, there are no awful Banshees albums, just ones that I prefer over others. Feel free to let me know your ranking in the comments. Shall we get on? At 11, I've got Join Hands. I've never been able to connect with this album personally. The band's second album is, in many ways, a lot heavier and darker than its predecessor. I haven't got a problem with any of those elements out of context, but I think it's because it's First World War themed that's the big turn off for me. There's only one track that grabs my attention on this album, and that's Love in a Void. This harks back to something that may have appeared on their debut, The Scream, with its punk stylings pushed to the fore. I mean, a huge amount of respect for the band for taking on the subject of war and pushing an anti-war agenda and sentiment. But as an album, I've just never connected with this one. At 10, we have Through the Looking Glass. This one, it's at a disadvantage due to it being a covers album. Released in 1987, the band bring mainly different interpretations of songs by The Doors, Iggy Pop, Billie Holiday and Bob Dylan, amongst others. Their version of Your Lost Little Girl by The Doors sounds like a 60s Phil Spector produced affair, until it temporarily disappears down the rabbit hole at about 1:40 in. Other than some additional brass, Iggy Pop's The Passenger doesn't sound that far off the beaten track, but it does sound fresh and invigorated. The centerpiece comes from the most unlikely of sources, which is this Wheels on Fire by Bob Dylan. Oh my god, this sounds like a Banshees original with its euphoric chorus and its orchestral flourishes. Their take is absolutely flawless, and this is a classic. Overall, an interesting album, albeit one that makes you forget that it's a covers album 1 minute and then jolts you back into the reality of these are other people's songs when it doesn't work. At 9, I've got The Rapture. The band's 11th and final album was released way back in 1995. In fairly typical Banshees style, they front load the album with one of their singles, Oh Baby. Produced by John Cale, I was never a fan of this single. It kind of trundles safely to the finish line with some fairly cringy synth parts. Tearing Apart is just as mainstream and, in my opinion, isn't really that memorable. Stargazer picks things up a little bit more with a swagger reminiscent of more engaging Banshees albums. But Fall From Grace is a fall from grace. But Not Forgotten and Sick Child returns things to grace with a quick apology. And so it goes. We get some decent tracks, but then the run of quality is interrupted by songs that maybe should have been B-sides. Overall, a bit of a patchy album. A few weeks after its release, the band were dropped by their record label. It's kind of a shame that it had to end with this album, really. Would have wanted it to end on a higher note. At 8, I've got The Scream. The band's debut was released in 1978. Mainly post-punk, it clings onto the rim of punk proper with tracks such as Jigsaw Feeling, Carcass and the wonderful Mirage. Elsewhere, the more angular Overground and Metal Postcode bring range and depth. Heck, there's even a Beatles cover in Helter Skelter, not that it will be immediately obvious. Closer Switch, with its more meandering guitar parts, functions as a sign of things to come on subsequent albums. Not that anyone would have known that at the time, of course. Some versions of the album include the singles Hong Kong Garden and The Staircase. Whilst this wasn't the initial plan, and you could say that this disrupts the running order, it does add 2 essential singles to the mix. Overall, this album could have been on one high-octane level, but its mix of punk and post-punk add range and depth. At 7, Kaleidoscope. Musically, the band's 3rd album made a sharp left turn with the arrival of 2 new band members, Budgie and John McGeoch. Compared to their previous album Join Hands, that referenced the heavy subject of war, Kaleidoscope introduces itself with Happy House. With a lighter touch, at least musically, this album opener feels like coming up for air. At the time, it marked a full extraction of any remnants of punk that might have been still hanging about their sound. You could probably say in the nick of time, because it was 1980, punk was gone, and the bands that were still left had to find other avenues to survive. It's sad really that such an influential genre had to burn out so quickly, leaving bands and artists a little lost in its wake. But that's not to say that Kaleidoscope sounds like a band scrabbling for a new home. They always had more post-punk rather than pure punk running through their veins. Foreboding's second track, Tenant, with its phase bass line, fully opens the door to post-punk and welcomes it in. It would only have kept ringing. Kaleidoscope may be predominantly more introspective than previous albums, but it's not without its exhilarating moments. Skin races along to the extent that you're worried about Budgie's arms. Trophy is both dynamic and catchy, with its descending chords on the chorus. A strong album that, at the time, hinted at band longevity and survival. At 6, I've got Peep Show. I can imagine that when this album was released, there must have been a bunch of die-hard Banshees fans that were more than a little concerned about single and opener Peekaboo. It's because you're hit by these reverse samples and this whole hip-hop style. It was 1988 and these elements were everywhere, forming the musical landscape of the time. But actually, anyone listening more closely would have realised that Peekaboo is a jaw-dropping slice of studio trickery. It apparently took the band a year to complete this song. Even today, it remains a pile of glorious madness. And this wasn't even indicative of the rest of the album. So as an antidote, second track and fellow single This Killing Jar brings its strings and its euphoric chorus into the mix. Scarecrow contains these spiky elements, technical musical term, that hark back to earlier albums, placing things firmly on familiar ground. But elsewhere, they continue to push their eclecticism. Burn Up is practically old school rock and roll. Rawhead manages to be both playful and sinister, and The Last Beat of My Heart sounds like an emotional climax to a musical. Generally, this is an eclectic and satisfying album. At 5, Superstition. Flaunting my favourite of their album covers, this one was released in 1991. Big single Kiss Them For Me may sound very 1991, but also deliciously fresh. Fear of the Unknown overcomes its slightly tinny production when it starts to fill out with its instrumentation. Cry may be ultra melodic, but it's dynamic and features a strong vocal from Siouxsie. Drifter slows things down with its beautiful cinematic flourishes, and so does Little Sister with its genius synth riffs. Single Shadow Time will have you loving this album at this point. Elsewhere, the skip of Got to Get Up will get you up, and Softly will put you gently to sleep, in a good way. Possibly the band's most beautiful album. At 4, I've got Hyena. Released in 1984, it's the only Banshees album to feature Robert Smith temporarily on guitars. This album has some great tracks. Opener Dazzle, dazzles, really. with its 27-piece orchestra that not only top and tails it, but features prominently throughout. Swimming Horses will sound very familiar to Cure fans, as the piano riff was reused on 6 different ways from Head on a Door, but it stands on its own 2 feet here as an album highlight. Another highlight is the almost Western infused Bring Me the Head of the Preacher Man with its spiralling guitar. Weaving its hypnotic spell, it's an epic that doesn't let up. We then continue with that quality on Running Town, Pointing Bone and Blow the House Down. Whilst this album has some phenomenal tracks, I just think it suffers a little bit due to track positioning. After the opener Dazzle, we get We Hunger. Not a bad track, but it is a dip after the epic opener. It's then followed by the strange organ-backed Take Me Back that really feels like it's missing something more substantial, but a really great album overall. At 3, I've got A Kiss in the Dream House. It's the best place to kiss. Despite being released in 1982, this album feels more fully formed than its successor, Hyena. If you played them both to a non-Siouxsie convert, they might say that this one is the more contemporary of the two. Featuring a rich tapestry of instruments, including chimes, bells and recorders, the band really pushed the boundaries with this album. The sultry Obsession with a close mic'd Siouxsie features these almost church bells. And then in walks an orchestra. Well, they don't walk in, they were already sat. Single Melt is sensual, both musically and lyrically, and those backing vocals make you melt. In contrast, the exhilarating Painted Bird is on the front foot with those driving drums. Cocoon is like a photo negative of lounge jazz, with its swing-like brushes on the snare. Then we're into the plucky and spiky single Slow Dive, with its spindly string section. An enthralling listen. At 2, I've got Juju, many people's number 1, and to be honest, I went back and forth on the positioning of these final 2 albums. Juju starts with that spiralling guitar part that leads to the manic strumming on opener Spellbound. Into the Light's angular but catchy rhythm and guitar parts make you wonder why it was never a single. Then we're into Arabian Nights that I always thought shouldn't be a single. Maybe it should swap with Into the Light and call it quits. Halloween's rushing beat is exhilarating, especially with those rolling toms. Night Shift has a creeping dread about it. I wouldn't want to wait for the night shift with that lurking in the shadows. Sin in My Heart is catchy and dark and brings in more of those rolling toms. Poor Budgie. Voodoo Dolly is terrifying. Don't play it alone at night in a forest. Generally, I'd say that Juju was the Banshees' most gothic album. This is why it finds itself high up on goth album rankings, which means that my number 1 is Tinderbox. It starts well with the usual Banshees style of a single in Candyman, one of their strongest singles in my opinion. The Sweetest Chill will proceed to woo you further with its gentle guitar before building to staccato strings. And in case you were getting too comfy, The Unrest will slap you about with its schizophrenic tempo changes. And then it's Citizen Dust. What a single, what a vocal. This was the first Banshees song I ever heard, so this one is special. It came on after the Mission's Love Me to Death in a club, and it just flowed, and nothing more to say about that. Even the more mainstream Canons and Parties Fall hold their own. And I think that's because it's followed by the beauty that is 92 Degrees. Finally, Land's End sounds like it's speeding towards Land's End without any brakes. And then it's all over. For me, this is the perfect balance between the rasping and the beautifully melodic. Extra points earned due to its housing of my first heard Banshees track. So there it is. All the Banshees albums ranked by me. What I will say is that this band cover almost every genre. There's punk, lounge jazz, a bit of hip hop, and then just straightforward goth that probably wasn't labelled as such at the time. A rich tapestry with very little filler. Fancy ranking them yourself? Go on, give it a go, and let me know how you get on. Until next time.